Hi, everyone. My name is Bianca McCarthy, and thank you so much for joining me today. But first, let me apologize for having to present to you via a pre-recorded video. That was not the intention, but there were some technical problems on my end that I couldn't resolve in time. All things going well, however, I hope to be available after today's presentation to answer any questions that you might have. So now we've got that out of the way, I want to thank James and the conference organizers for inviting me to present today, despite my not being an educator. This is actually the first time I'm speaking at a conference like this as a keynote presenter. You know, if you had asked me to present about my research, I could probably, speak for days. But something like this requires a little bit more preparation, but I'm really excited to be here, and so thank you. Thank you for your time. So in my presentation today, I'm not going to be really speaking about education per se with any facts or figures. I will leave that to the experts. Today, I want to really just talk about my experience, my journey through education in Japan and in Australia, and how these experiences best prepared me for working in the sciences in Japan and in Australia. So the title of my presentation today is An Introduction to My Biology. And today, I'm really just going to be talking about my journey and my story. And I hope to be just one example of how a student who has grown up in between two cultures has made it work. So like I said, I'm not an educator, but rather I consider myself to be a scientist turned marketer. I currently work for the Lubrizol Corporation, which is an American entity owned by Berkshire Hathaway. But I am based in Meguro in Tokyo. So Lubrizol is a manufacturer of various chemicals for use across different industries, from pharmaceuticals and health through to automotive and lubricants. I work in the life sciences division, specifically in beauty and personal care. I want to just take this opportunity to share with you a brief video introducing Lubrizol and what it is we do.
Begin each day feeling more beautiful. Live a healthier life. And return home to more comfortable living. Around the world, people are inspired to live better through innovations created in partnership with Lubrizol Life Science. Following a pathway from concept to commercialization, Lubrizol Life Science works proactively with your team to accelerate your products to market, including solutions in hair care, skin care, and cleansing that inspire a more beautiful life. Complex pharmaceuticals and innovative medical devices that enable healthier living. And concepts in fabric, surface, and dish care that bring a greater sense of comfort into the home. World-renowned and responsible science setting a clear direction toward a sustainable future. Market-ready solutions driven by consumer insights to ensure your continued growth. That's the life-advancing, life-enhancing promise of a partnership with Lubrizol Life Science.
So that's Lubrizol. I joined Lubrizol in 2020, actually just about 1 month before the pandemic really hit Japan. However, my entire career, if I think back, which started in about 2011, has been entirely in the cosmetics and personal care industry. I've actually never worked in any other industry. In 2011, after I graduated from university, I started off in Australia working as a formulation chemist, which means that I formulated and made things like shampoos and conditioners and creams and lotions, and I really got my foot in the door in the cosmetics industry at a small contract manufacturer, doing really a little bit of everything. I was there for 3 years or so. And then I moved to Sydney, where I worked for a Dutch chemical distribution company called IMCD. I was there for about 3 years, and then I made the big move from Australia to Japan. In 2017, I joined Shiseido and worked at the Global Innovation Center as a researcher. And here I worked with some incredible researchers in the field of photobiology and discovering new mechanisms for how UV damaged the skin, and helped with product development and innovation for new products that haven't even been launched yet. So I was there for about 3 years and then moved to Lubrizol, where I am now. So if I think back on the past 10 years, which all was in the beauty and personal care industry, I realized actually that I've spent about half of it as a scientist, so as a lab-based scientist doing experiments, and the other half in business and sales roles. So I really consider myself to kind of be at the interface of technical and business development, which really what my role is now. It's really at the interface of those two groups. How did I get here? I'd like to, we are at an educational conference, so I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about my personal education. I started my education actually here in Japan. I was born in Japan, in Fujisawa, and I attended the first year of elementary school at St. Joseph's International School in Yokohama. For those of you who might not be familiar with the school, St. Joseph's was one of Japan's oldest international schools, established in 1901. It did, however, close down in 1995. So I did the first year of elementary school at St. Joseph's before our family moved to Brisbane, Australia. Now, quite a big move. Our whole family moved from Yokohama to Brisbane, and in 1995 or so, Brisbane was a very small town, so it was a really, really big move for our family. So once we settled down in Brisbane, Australia, I went to a Catholic primary school called Our Lady of the Angels, and here I repeated grade 1 and went through to grade 7. I repeated grade 1 because my English level was not so great, and I was a really shy kid, and the teachers thought it best that I repeated grade 1. So I ended up being a year older than everyone in my class. So I hit grade 7, and in Australia at the time, there was no middle school, so I went straight from primary school to high school, and the high school I went to was called All Hallows School, and this was an all-girls Catholic school. And I attended All Hallows from grade 8 to grade 12. So following this, I attended the local university, the University of Queensland, and here I did a Bachelor of Science degree majoring in chemistry and biochemistry, and I did an extra research year, which we call an honours year, which is equivalent to a master's degree in other countries. So I took a few years off work. I took a few years off study to work full time, and during that time, I did a diploma. I did a short course in Belgium. I did a little bit of education here and there, but it wasn't until 2014 that I went back to education in a formal capacity to do my PhD at the University of Sydney. There are so many jobs that you can have with a science degree across so many different fields and industries. If I think back on my university days and some of the friends I studied with, many of them who have science degrees ended up going into medicine as nurses, doctors, occupational therapists. I have other friends who moved out to working in mining towns, working as geologists. And of course, I have many friends who ended up staying in university, in academia as researchers and as lecturers. But equally, I also have many friends from my degrees who chose not to stay in the sciences. So one guy pops into mind who has now become an economist at a very big bank. So the skills you learn in a science degree, especially degrees like master's degrees and PhDs, they really help you hone your skills in things like observation, reasoning, analysis, but also help you develop skills like time management, project management, and general communication skills. And all of these skills give you that power and that flexibility to jump around within the science field, but also help you move and jump around to other areas of science and even beyond into different industries. And of course, country borders become blurred as well. A science degree can help you work in Germany, Japan. There is a lot of power and flexibility in a science degree, and I really couldn't recommend it higher enough. So, to be honest with you, I fell into the cosmetics and personal care industry by chance. I graduated from my degree and I did apply for a few jobs, and I really wanted to just be in a lab. And it just so happened that the first job offer I received was at a cosmetic manufacturing facility. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I first thought about the cosmetics and personal care industry, I really didn't give it much thought. I kind of thought that shampoos and creams and all that just came out of a mysterious black box somewhere. I really didn't give it a second thought. But turns out it's an absolutely fascinating industry, and I'm really, really lucky that I fell into it. One of the reasons why I love this industry so much is because it's an accessible form of science. What do I mean by that? Most people will use a shampoo or a body wash or a cream or a lotion or maybe just a bar of soap. But each of those products has a really solid science behind it. And when you start talking to people about that, it becomes really interesting for them. So every time I talk to someone about my work, it becomes a really interesting discussion because that person can relate it to their everyday life. So it's a really accessible form of science. And I love it very, very much. So while I still maybe consider myself a scientist at heart, I technically don't work in the sciences anymore. My official title is as a market development manager, which is at the interface between research and business development. So I like to think of myself as a bridge or as a science communicator. So in my role now at Lubrizol, I work with cosmetic and personal care brands across the Asia Pacific region and help them develop innovative new products to address current and future consumer needs, preferably using raw materials developed by Lubrizol. So while my job now is as a communicator, as a bridge, I couldn't do my job effectively if I didn't have experience working deep in the dermatological sciences, nor could I do this job effectively without some sort of sales experience either. So my job now, it's not all glitz and glamour, and it's not always working with the top, most famous cosmetic brands. In fact, much of 2020 was working with manufacturers of hand sanitizer gels, which of course form such an important part of our everyday hygiene practices these days. So here I would just have a short video to show you how Lubrizol played a small part in helping support hand sanitizing gels, especially during the early stages of the pandemic.
Lubrizol is taking action to support the fight against COVID-19. The WHO recommends sanitizing hands frequently by either using alcohol-based hand sanitizer or washing hands with soap and water for 20 seconds. Today, Lubrisol's carbopol polymers are used as a thickening agent in most hand sanitizers. Since January 2020, the team has tripled the supply of the carbopol polymer grades typically used in hand sanitizer applications. These actions are enabling over 1 billion additional bottles of hand sanitizer per month. But that's not all. Lubrisol's surfactants are an essential ingredient used in most hand soaps, helping to improve the foam and cleansing performance. Our continued manufacturing enables over 9 million bottles of hand soap per month. Making these essential ingredients is one of the many ways Lubrizol is proud to help improve lives across the globe. Thank you to our hardworking teams that make this possible. For more information, visit www.lubrizol.com/COVID-19.
So in today's presentation, I'm not going to be focusing so much directly on working as a scientist or as a woman in science, even though these are very important topics that really do need to be addressed. And instead, however, I want to use the lens of being a woman in science to talk about the importance of global calibration in modern Japan. What is global calibration? Not quite sure if it's in the dictionary, and I'm not going to take full credit for this term either. It was first introduced to me early on in my career by a mentor I had. So I would have been in my early 20s, 22, 23, and it was long before I even thought about moving overseas. My mentor and I would get into discussions about global calibration and diversity and inclusion, because it's just so relevant to the modern world. But what am I talking about? I'm getting ahead of myself. To calibrate. So we know that we have to calibrate equipment in a lab. We have to calibrate machinery. It's that process of correction, of checking and adjusting in comparison with a standard. Now, if we put a global in front of that calibration, all of a sudden what we're adjusting is not bits of equipment. We're adjusting our values, attitudes, and beliefs, especially in relation to other people and other cultures. So there is no doubt that global calibration is growing in importance, and it will not only impact our workplaces and our work styles, but it will also impact our day-to-day interactions with other human beings in a social setting. But who's responsible for your global calibration? Who's responsible for the global calibration of our students? What systems are in place to give students the best chance of success in an increasingly diverse world? Before we get to the how, let's quickly take a look at what we're aiming for. What does a globally calibrated workplace look like? I would categorize a globally calibrated workplace run by globally calibrated people to value these 4 qualities: diversity, inclusion, accountability, and transparency. Now, I'll just very briefly explain what I mean by that. So, diversity. A globally calibrated workplace not only prioritizes hiring a range of competent people of different gender, race, ethnicity, religious, age, background, and personality types, but they also prioritize promoting a diverse range of people into key leadership positions because representation matters, and it will set a positive example for others and will be aspirational for younger workers too. Inclusion. Now, a globally calibrated workplace acknowledges individual differences and how these individual differences shape each person's unique attitudes and expectations at work. Accountability. A globally calibrated workplace has role models that speak up against biases, will go against the grain, will stand out and speak up, and they'll take responsibility for their actions. And transparency. A globally calibrated workplace is one that communicates clearly and openly to their employees and isn't afraid to bring up bad news first. So you'll notice that in this list, I don't have things like workplaces that communicate only in English or completely westernized or has great lunches. Communication is important. Work culture is important. However, in my experience, a work environment that understands and respects each other's differences and takes proactive steps to bridge that gap is a better place to work. So we've taken a look at the kind of workplace we're aiming for, somewhere that values diversity, inclusion, accountability, and transparency. But how can we get there? Today, I want to propose 4 steps that we can take that will help us and others be more globally calibrated. So the 4 steps that I propose towards being more globally calibrated is to 1, be a community that celebrates diversity. 2, to enjoy education without social pressures. 3, to realize early on that the secret to working hard is to love what you do. And 4, above all, have a growth mindset. Now, for the rest of today's presentation, I'm going to be giving you some examples of my own experiences and really why I think these 4 are so important. So let's get into it. So the first point, to be a community that celebrates diversity. Growing up in Australia, I was fortunate enough to be in a community made up of different people, of different genders, ethnicities, religions, backgrounds, all throughout primary school and high school and even through to tertiary education and even into the workforce. I was always surrounded by people who looked different, sounded different, and acted different to me. It wasn't until I moved to Japan, or rather back to Japan, that I appreciated the diversity of the culture I came from. There have been times where I've been dragged to dinner parties as the token foreigner to meet people who had never met a foreigner before. I still get on trains and sit on the train and have empty seats next to me, even if the train is packed. There was one time even when someone was brave enough to sit next to me, but decided to put their briefcase in between he and I so that I guess we wouldn't be physically touching. These stories aren't unique. Most foreigners living in Japan will have experienced some form of discrimination. For me, in all of the situations like this that I've been in, they make me feel different, but not in an empowered way. Some days when things get really bad, I feel just so closed off from the rest of the world. Even though we have social media and phones and we can reach out to other people, you just feel closed off and it's almost like a claustrophobic feeling. So there are some days where I feel down, but then there are other days where I feel rebellious. I feel like I want to be louder. I want to stand out even more. I want to be even more different just to make a point to the people around me. But most days I'm quite conservative and I sit in the middle somewhere. Living in Japan these past 4 years, the times I've felt most comfortable, the most confident, and the most empowered are when I'm surrounded by people who respect the differences we have in each other. And it's one thing to say that you respect the differences, but for me, I see this when I see people or I work with people who are really proactive in helping making your life a little bit easier. And they're brave enough to try new things and to come down to your level a little bit. And so communities, workplaces, social groups, any community that celebrates diversity, what they're doing is fostering an environment that promotes empathy and encourages people to do things like offer help before being asked or think before what's required of them. You know, there is nothing more global than celebrating diversity and prioritizing inclusion. These are key factors in global calibration. My second point is to enjoy education without social pressures. So, growing up in Australia and going through the school system there, I never felt the pressure to do well at school so that I could get into the best high school or university. In other words, getting into the right high school or university was never made out to be the key objective of my education or a key objective of my education. Now, I'm sure this has a lot to do with the structure of the educational system in Australia, and I do understand that there are differences in that. But I do get a little bit of a kick when I speak to my Japanese friends and they ask me about the differences between Australia and Japanese universities. My answer usually is that Australian universities are easy to get into, but difficult to graduate from. And the point I'm trying to make is that, most kids, they don't peak in high school or elementary school for that matter. It's really expected that you thrive and flourish in university as an adult. And that was the case for me. I was never the top student. And there were some science subjects I failed in high school, no doubt. Even in university, there were a couple of subjects that I did not do well in. But I was always a curious kid and I loved to try new things, whether it be music or sport. There was one year where I read about a really interesting sounding science camp and I just decided to go. I ended up loving this camp so much that I went back year after year. And by grade 12, I was on a small team that ran the camp. And I even traveled to the Atlanta International School in the USA to help run the first camp there. So I really attribute my finding science, it was quite organic and quite natural. And I attribute this to the freedom that my parents and teachers gave me to explore my interests. I felt like I was shielded from social pressures and I was allowed to simply enjoy learning. And of course, this led me to discover science, which obviously made a lasting impact on other areas of my life. So enjoying education without social pressures will give students the freedom to explore their own interests and allow them to develop as individuals. Another key point of global calibration. So number 3, the secret to working hard is to love what you do. Truth be told, I've been quite selective in the type of places I work. When looking for PhD projects, there's a lot of information online recommending you to prioritize choosing the right supervisor over the project itself. And for some reason, I really took this message to heart. One of the first labs I worked in was run by Professor Elizabeth Gillum. She warmly welcomed me into a group when I was in my second year of university and I didn't have any experience working in the lab. Off the bat, she took me seriously and she believed in me, and she herself taught me the ropes and how to do the experiments in her lab. And working so closely with her, her passion for her very niche field of science called directed evolution became really evident, and it was quite contagious. Later on, Liz would publish in many high-impact journals like Nature and be considered one of the pioneers of directed evolution. So it was really quite an honor to work with her so early in my career. My PhD supervisor was another incredible woman by the name of Professor Rebecca Mason. She was not only the head of our lab, but she was also the head of the Department of Physiology and also sat on the board for a number of different government advisory groups as well. When she took me on as a student, she was a few years from retirement, so she wasn't a spring chicken, but she worked harder than anyone in our lab and was always remarkably direct with her students. Sometimes it was a little bit terrifying, but you knew she was always looking out for your best interests, and she was so passionate about the field of photobiology we worked in. And we really believed that our research was making a difference. And so we were all aligned on that goal. Working so closely with these women, I noticed that despite the long hours they pulled and the many frustrations they faced, especially being in academia, both of them were absolutely passionate about their research and also really passionate about developing their students too. You could see it every day in their interaction with their team. You know, this level of passion doesn't have to directly apply to work. It can also apply to your hobbies, whether it's baking or sports or whatever it is. I strongly believe that you have to do something, whether it's work or baking or sports, but do something with passion, because the world needs more passionate people, and you end up being a role model for someone else, someone in your sport group, someone in your working environment. And this has a roll-on effect for the next generation. And the final step, above all, have a growth mindset. So I may be biased, but I strongly believe that people with a science background are inherently have a growth mindset. Why? Well, technically speaking, as a scientist, you are judged by how many papers you publish, how many patents you publish. So this motivates you to keep on innovating and creating something new. So science doesn't end with graduating with a PhD or publishing one paper. You constantly need to prove yourself relevant. And of course, this can be very stressful, but it does motivate you to keep on learning new techniques and collaborating with other researchers. Science is also full of failed experiments, failed grant rejections, and generally things being out of your control. And so this also prepares your mind to see that there is no such thing as failure, only feedback. As scientists, you learn through trial and error, and this spills over to other aspects of your life too. Through trial and error, you are introduced to a new way of doing things, a new way of thinking, and you have to be open to accepting that change in order to progress. So inherently, scientists have a growth mindset. But saying that, of course, you don't need to be in the sciences to demonstrate a growth mindset. You can demonstrate it in other aspects of your life. You know, whether it's challenging yourself to learn a new skill, a new language, picking up a new hobby. Everyone is able to grow. And if everyone can demonstrate that growth mindset and make small and meaningful changes in their attitudes and actions, well, that is the definition of calibration. That's where we started in this presentation, and it's actually quite a perfect way to end. So the 4 lessons that I wanted to share with you today from my personal experiences are, diverse community, enjoying education, to love what you do, and to have a growth mindset. Of course, you don't need to move to Australia, or you don't have to be a scientist to experience these same benefits. A global mindset starts at home, it starts at school, and many of the things I spoke about, like enjoying education, loving what you do, and a growth mindset, these can be replicated with the support of family, educators, and community wherever you are. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for letting me share my experiences with you. I hope we have time for a short discussion. And please, I really look forward to hearing from all of you. So thank you very much.